With Terraria Journey's End, also known as Terraria 1.4, out for the PC, it's time to consider how you can prepare for Journey's End if you're playing on another version. This is of course optional, but some of you might like to hit the ground running once 1.4 comes out for your platform's version of Terraria. So if you're a mobile or console player who doesn't want to miss a beat, keep watching. Here are 3 tips for preparing for Journey's End. The ultimate weapon. Let's start with an easy one, the ZENITH. It's so good it's practically cheating. Just look at this thing, it's amazing. You know you want one. And you can get one the moment the patch hits. All you need is a hard mode anvil and several weapons in your inventory, and it's that last bit that might be the catch, because you might not have those weapons. So let's talk about those weapons. The first one is the big one, it's the Terra Blade, and there's an entire crafting chain for this. I'll link to the wiki entries so that you can find out everything you need to know. Long story short, you're going to want 2 Broken Hero swords from the Solar Eclipse event, 1 True Knight's Edge, and 1 True Excalibur. Again, read the link if you need to find out how to get those 2 weapons. Craft them all up and you'll have the Terra Blade. Next is the Meowmere. The Moonlord drops this, hopefully. All the more reason to start now. Meowmere is a really fun weapon, but ZENITH's even better, so I would say it's definitely worth consuming the Meowmere. And besides, once you have the ZENITH, it's going to be a lot easier to get the Meowmere from Moonlord. Next up is the Star Wrath sword. This is also dropped by the Moonlord. Not much more to say about it than that. Also, you'll need the Influx Waver. This is dropped during the Martian invasion event. It's dropped by the toughest enemy during that event, the Martian Saucer. So you might already have one if you've already farmed for the UFO flying mount. I'll include a link to the Martian invasion event guide that I made if you need to learn more about that. Next up is the Horseman's Blade. This is dropped by the Pumpkin during the Pumpkin Moon event. I'm going to include a link below to the guide I recently made on that event and how to get the Horseman's Blade. Next up is Seedler. This is dropped by Plantaria. You may already have one. If not, start smashing those jungle bulbs. Next is Star Fury. You've likely already encountered this. There's one in every game. There's, I believe, 1 copy in every world in one of the floating island chests. So if you don't have it yet, just explore those floating islands in your world and you should find one. You're also going to need a Beekeeper sword. This is a drop from the Queen Bee. It's not too hard to get. If you don't have one, just go through the beehives in your jungle biome and trigger the Queen Bee fights until one drops. An enchanted sword, you may or may not have one of these lying around. They're found in these sword shrines. If need be, just spawn some new small worlds until you find a narrow passage leading down from the surface. I've always seen them in the forest biomes, often encounter them pretty far from the central spawn point, so if you don't have one, just keep on looking and eventually you'll find a shrine with one of those short swords in it that you can get. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the Copper Short Sword. So it is good for something. I guess it finally is useful. And that's probably why they threw it in there. Anyway, combine all of those swords and you've got the ZENITH. And you can see here why a head start will help you out a lot if this is something you want right off the bat. And I'll add that the best modifier for this in reforging is legendary, and it's gonna cost you a pretty penny unless you're quite lucky in terms of the reforging bill. So I would say to get this, you really also want to save up several platinum for the inevitable bill with the Goblin Tinkerer, because it's worth getting that good prefix. Next up is NPC Happiness. NPCs in 1.4 have happiness meters. That's right, you've got to keep your town denizens happy. And happiness affects NPC behaviors. Happy NPCs make your life better. Unhappy NPCs make your life worse. And it all boils down to where they want to live and who they want to live with. That big sprawling base you've built, it might look cool, but it's not what makes the NPCs happy in 1.4. They're going to view it as too crowded, it's not necessarily going to be in the right biome for them, and it's going to be surrounded with NPCs that they don't like, so that's something to consider. It sounds complicated, but it's actually not bad. I'll include a link to the wiki entry covering NPC Happiness, but suffice it to say, you'll want to build a smaller community in each biome. And that will mean a 3 or 4 person home in each of the biomes. Now, the zones where certain NPCs want to live include the following biomes: forest, hollow, snow, desert, jungle, ocean, mushroom, and underground. So that's quite a bit, and it's going to really spread out your bases throughout the world, which I suppose is the whole point of the design. And gone will be the days of one huge forest base in the middle of the map. So what if you don't change your base, you might be asking? Well, if you're not going to adapt to the new NPC Happiness system, vendor pricing is going to get worse, the angler quest rewards are weaker, and the tax collector's payouts slow down. And the opposite is going to be true with happy NPCs, so they do make it worth your while to make the change. Now, armed with this knowledge of the housing demands in 1.4, you may or may not want to act on it. Perhaps your plan is to create a brand new 1.4 world gen world, and that's fine. But if you're like me and you're somewhat attached to the pre-existing world that you've been using for a long time, then you can certainly get ahead of the curve and just go ahead and start building these bio-themed houses for your NPCs that they can move into once the patch arrives. They certainly don't need to move in yet, but it's nice to have them there. And in case you didn't know, there are 2 new NPCs making an appearance in 1.4, the golfer and the zoologist. So if you're an NPC completionist like myself, don't forget to account for those 2 new houses that you will need. And apparently they both prefer the forest biome, if that's any assistance to you. Now, the bonus for going the extra mile to keep all of these NPCs happy is the fact that in Journey's End, they've added pylons which allow for fast travel between the biomes. So if you have a settlement in, say, the snow biome, you can use a pylon there to travel back to your forest base, or to travel to your jungle base, that sort of thing. And so soon you'll be able to teleport all over the map without the hassle and expense of having to wire teleporters. So it's a nice little system, and all the more reason to plan ahead for those biome settlements, right? So get building. Tougher bosses. With the 1.4 patch, the bosses are going to get tougher. Maybe you like that, maybe you don't, but that's the lay of the land. And I would say most importantly, the Moon Lord is going to be able to hit through solid blocks with its, and this is the official term, its phantasmal death ray. This means that if you've gotten used to cheesing the Moon Lord using some sort of stationary boss arena, you're probably going to be out of luck unless you come up with a new strat. And you're likely just going to have to learn to be more nimble. What it also means is that if you want to get some valuable Moon Lord loot for use in 1.4, you're probably going to have an easier time of it before the patch arrives. So if you're at that point in your game's progress, I would suggest going ahead and start farming the Moon Lord for all of those great drops. Some of which, as I mentioned earlier, are necessary to get the game's ultimate weapon, the ZENITH sword. Now similarly, they've actually buffed the Golem boss a little bit. I don't suspect this will be a huge challenge, but all the same, it's less easy to get stuck or to get the Golem stuck. They've made it a little more difficult. This is something to keep in mind if you're not a fan of that fight. And then one last thing, if you're playing an older version of Terraria, there is an exploit involving the slime mount and target dummies. It involves basically maxing out the collision detection and making you mostly invulnerable to attacks. It's a good way to avoid taking much damage. It never worked against the Moon Lord, but it was still useful in a number of other situations. Well, apparently they've fixed this in 1.4, so if it's something you've been using or wanted to try out, you're going to want to try it out before the Journey's End patch arrives. Again, a somewhat rare trick, but it's something you can use to cheese the game before the 1.4 patch. And the takeaway from all of this, get those events and bosses completed before Journey's End if you want an easier time of it. And that's it. I'd say the main takeaways for preparation, and there aren't many, but the main takeaways are this. The first, go ahead and get the components for the Zenith. The second, consider building those NPC settlements around the map so that they can be happy from day one and you can get those pylons running. And then the third is get those boss fights out of the way. I would say especially the Moonlord fight. Not only because some of its drops are used to craft the Zenith, but you might want some of the other drops too. And the Moonlord's not going to get any easier if you're used to cheesing him. So go ahead and get those kills in on the Moonlord, get that loot, and get in there before the challenge is increased. Anyway, that's all, folks. Hopefully it won't be too long in coming to your system. Again, all of this is optional. This is just something I had in mind for those of you while you're waiting for 1.4 to drop. You might consider doing. It's kind of like being proactive before 1.4. And in a way, you're playing for 1.4 and doing all of this, aren't you? Because I guess it's the preliminary stages of 1.4 gameplay. That's a positive spin on it. Anyway, thanks for listening to me if you stayed this long. That's all I have to say on 1.4. Again, hopefully it drops soon for your system, and I'll see you in the next video.